had in the 1930s is debatable. Then I would say there's really a greater role for public investment in infrastructure. Since the G20 has been emphasizing a lot on private investment, but nothing really has, it has not gained much traction. I think you need to look at more roles for the public sector, may not be directly to the budget, but getting savings, even private savings somehow into infrastructure, that would need some intermediation by MDBs, which are actually quasi sort of public investment sort of entities, or as Mr. Yoshino had pointed out in the morning, that what Japan did, it was through their publicly owned banking system and the Ministry of Finance. They got private savings and redirected them to infrastructure. And lower oil prices can be used for, there's a big opportunity now that you need to, you can step up investment in infrastructure, but then you would need to have some degree of public expenditure switching, which is difficult, from consumption to investment. External surpluses and liquidity needs to be diverted to infrastructure investment, and here MDBs can play a big role. The G20, it's really part of the incomplete G20 agenda. It was more, I think, a statement of intent to get MDBs to finance for infrastructure, but as I said that they were not given adequate resources. And one criticism for this is that this would lead to a runaway staff expansion in the MDBs. That is the concern, let us say, in the US Treasury and some of the advanced countries, their treasuries. But then, since MDB lending is all given against sovereign guarantees, it need not be, through project finance. It could be through budget support with, the World Bank just having an over-supervisory, role. It need not be, supervising each project minutely as it does now. And of course, you need improved incentives and climate for long-term savings and investment. And the G20 is currently moving in this direction, but this is a very difficult area. We've been talking about it for a long time, but not much seems to have happened. So thank you for the patient hearing.
Thank you very much, Alok, for giving us a very nice overview of how G20's role in this whole infrastructure space has evolved over time, and also with some sobering thoughts towards the end that ultimately resolving issues in this area depends probably far more on domestic initiatives, resources, etc. Though obviously the MDBs and new MDBs like the IIB have a significant but not central role to play in this. That's the message at least I take away. Thank you. It's now my pleasure to welcome Tom. Tom Richardson is, as most of you know, been the IMF's senior resident representative in Delhi, covering also Nepal and Bhutan for just over 3 years. And he's opted for a 4th year, so I guess he's
I like it here.
Comfortable here. Yeah, and we are certainly comfortable having him here. So Tom is also, as I understand it, going to talk about kind of from the international comparisons and issues on public investment in infrastructure and so forth. The next 2 speakers, I think, will focus much more, I anticipate, on the infrastructure challenges as we see them in India, or at least as government and financial intermediaries see them in India. So with that, Tom, over to you. And if I can just mention, if we can stick to 15 minutes, it would be very helpful because
no problem.
There are 4 of you.
No problem. Thanks very much, Shankar and colleagues, for having me. I'll stick strictly to 15 minutes. I want to talk about one aspect of infrastructure investment. I'm by no means an infrastructure expert. I'm going to present other people's work, other people at the IMF's work. But I was thinking about this. I mean, as Alok, tried to awaken the audience a little bit with a story. So I was thinking about what kind of story could I tell you to kind of wake everybody up after lunch. And it occurred to me, you know, my brother, I'm an American, by the way. My brother is a pilot of riverboats, the big barges that push, you know, coal up the river and grain down the river on the Mississippi River. You know, these are boats that are as wide as this room, but 5 times as long. And he goes up and down the river pushing these barges. And he, at one point, told me that, you know, if you were to look at the bridges across the Mississippi River from where he sees them, from underneath, you'd think twice about driving across those bridges. So infrastructure is not just a question for emerging markets or developing economies. It's a question that is faced by, you know, all G20 countries and probably all countries. And so I think it really is a pan G20 question. If we can figure out how to make it more efficient, if we can figure out how to make the number of bridges that my brother feels comfortable driving over greater for a given amount of infrastructure investment, that would be all to the good. So that's the objective. I want to talk about how to make public spending on infrastructure investment more efficient. And this is linked to G20 work. It's some research that the G20 has asked the IMF to do, and we've done this, of course, in collaboration with colleagues of ours at the World Bank and other institutions. There are a couple of recent papers on this at the fund. The World Economic Outlook from a year ago had a big chapter on infrastructure investment, and then a June paper on our website at the IMF goes into great detail. So in essence, I'm presenting work done by my colleagues in the Fiscal Affairs Department on what we know about how to make infrastructure investment more efficient. The outline of my talk is simple. We know, and we pretty much know, I mean, from an econometric or empirical standpoint, we know that generally macroeconomic outcomes are better when public investment picks up, so that's a good thing. But we know that the efficiency of public investment management matters a lot, right? So if you spend a given amount of money, if you spend it well, you get more infrastructure out of it than if you spend it badly, and that can have a big impact. So what drives it? What drives public investment management efficiency? And there the answer, I think unsurprisingly, is that it's the institutions you have for managing your budget, managing public spending. So that's the outline. If you need to go run to the loo or get a cup of coffee, this is a good time, because I've already told you the outcome. I'm going to prove now that that's the case. So those who are really interested can stick around. So so in the October World Economic Outlook, they did a simulation to show what's the impact of a 1% of GDP kind of public investment shock. If you have more public investment. And you can see, broadly speaking, you get a substantial pickup in growth over 4 years. And you also get a dip in public sector debt. So public investment almost can pay for itself in a sense if you do it right. So that's the good news, right? So macroeconomic outcomes are better if you have substantial amounts of public investment. And that, of course, may depend on the initial starting conditions, right? If you start in a situation where there has been a lot of public investment over time, it may be that the marginal benefit is less, but, you know, broadly speaking, across a wide sample of countries, that's the result you get. What do we mean by efficiency of public investment? I mean, I'm an economist at the end of the day, so I'm thinking in terms of frontiers, right? So if you have inputs on the x-axis and outputs on the y-axis, there is some kind of frontier maximal amount of output that you would get for a given amount of infrastructure investment spending. And as long as you're below it, if you're below that frontier, it means you have some inefficiency in your public investment system. Right? Those of us who are economists will be very comfortable with this kind of thinking. So my colleagues at the fund pulled together a sample of over 100 countries, looking at things like how long is the road network, how much power generation is there, how much access to social infrastructure, clinics and education as well, and looked across countries. The blue circles are advanced economies. For those of you sitting way in the back, you can't see this necessarily, but the blue circles tend to be our advanced economies. The red diamonds are emerging market economies, and the black squares are low-income developing countries. Please, hi. No problem. So this is a measure of the frontier, kind of what we think the frontier looks like. If you take the best performing countries, that they set the frontier. and you look where are other countries relative to that frontier. This is, again, based on physical indicators. They also took a different stab at it. They sliced the onion a different way and asked, okay, how do business leaders, they relied on the World Economic Forum data to assess how do business leaders assess the quality of the various kinds of infrastructure. And again, pick the best performing countries in each category as the frontier, and then everybody else is below that frontier. So you can see that there is a gap for most countries between the best performing and those others. And then they pulled these together, these two measures, the physical indicator sample, where you have like the length of the road network, but you might have actually not very good roads, and the survey-based or perception-based indicator to come up with a hybrid indicator of investment efficiency. So this is just an assessment, kind of a snapshot of where we are now in terms of efficiency of public investment around the world. And why is it important? Well, it's important clearly because if you were to close that gap, if you were to bring countries up to the frontier, you'd get a substantial amount of extra infrastructure, a substantial amount of extra gain from a given amount of spending. So they pulled together this sample and looked across types of country, advanced economies, emerging markets, low-income developing countries, and then for all countries. And the average for the world as a whole is about 27% increase in output or extra infrastructure you'd get for a given amount of infrastructure spending. For advanced economies, it was a bit better, right? The gap was about 13%, about 27% for emerging markets as a class, and then about 40% for low-income developing countries. And I should note that the emerging market category has wide variation. So the tails, right, this kind of top of the line and bottom of the line, this box and tail approach shows that for emerging markets the variance is really wide. So what is another way to think about this? I mean, if you go back to the point that more public investment generates extra growth, well, if you look across these countries, by types of efficiency, right, the more efficient versus less efficient, you can see that more efficient countries get about, from a given 1% of GDP public investment shock, the highest or most efficient countries at spending public investment get about 0.6% after 4 years in terms of additional GDP. So that's not bad. And the lowest only get about 0.3%, a little bit less than 0.3%, which is another way of saying that if the countries that are the least efficient at managing public investment were to move to the frontier and be as efficient as the best, they could double effectively the amount of infrastructure they get from a given input of public investment. So that's why it's important. That's why it's macroeconomically important. So how do we judge the efficiency of public investment or the management? Well, my colleagues in the IMS Fiscal Affairs Department came up with a set of 3 broad categories of institutions or features of a system that would help you determine what works or what contributes to better efficiency. Planning institutions, allocating institutions, and implementing institutions. And these are really at different stages in the investment cycle. Planning institutions generally ensure that the macroeconomic environment is sustainable. You coordinate across levels of government, across sectors, with the private sector. Allocational efficiency, of course, comes from making sure that you're putting the money on the most effective sectors. If you think of my brother's analogy, we have lots of bridges up and down the Mississippi River. You're first fixing the bridge that has the most traffic, and then you fix the bridge that has the next most traffic. That kind of efficiency.
The one that's about to fall down.
If nobody's driving over it, then it doesn't matter. No, I'm just kidding. And, no, that is a good point, though. Of course, it's not. But it raises the whole question of how do you judge this? I think integrating recurrent budgets and capital budgets in a consistent, integrated way is really important. And then ensuring that the integrity or unity of the budget is preserved, so that you don't have too much government spending happening outside the government budget ambit. And then finally, and most importantly, in many parts of the world, ensuring that you actually get the project done, right? You may allocate the money, approve it, and then find that the project actually takes way too long to deliver. How did you put it, Alok, that it's over budget all the time, every time, or something like that? So implementing the project in a cost-effective and timely way is important. They came up within each of these broad categories, planning, allocating, and implementing, they came up with a set of 15 subcategories of metrics that you might look at to figure out which are good institutions and which are bad institutions. And why is this important? Well, then within each of these categories, each of these 15 categories, which include, for instance, under planning, that you manage PPPs well, or that you do project appraisal and selection well, or and so forth. For each of these 15 categories, they came up with a set of what's good performance, bad performance, and middling performance, and on that basis, they assessed a sample of 25 countries around the world, geographically and economically, or by level of development, diverse set of countries, including Germany, Finland, Japan, also India, Philippines, and South Africa in the EM category, and then low-income countries like Nepal, Uganda, where I used to work, and so forth. And so they show, unsurprisingly, that across this set of scores, that the advanced economies tend to be more efficient. They assess advanced economies to be a little bit more efficient at managing public investment than emerging markets, and emerging markets somewhat more effective than low-income developing countries. I mean, that's not surprising. We know that institutional strength varies across countries. It also varies across regions. And here you see, Europe being in the middle, thought to be generally quite good, particularly, in Northern Europe, at managing public investment. Interestingly enough, the Asia-Pacific region has the widest dispersion, right, from very good, well-managed public investment institutions to countries with somewhat less well-managed institutions. And so there is a diversity across the Asia-Pacific region, which I think is important. We wouldn't want to say that advanced economies are better at everything, because it's not correct. I mean, looking at this sample, you can see in some categories, the blue line on the circle, for those of you in the back, this is impossible to see, so I'll just tell you what it is. All 15 of the subcategories across the various stages of the investment cycle were evaluated. And the blue line on this kind of spider web chart is for advanced economies. And you see, in some cases, emerging markets do better than advanced economies. And I think that's interesting. And even in some cases, low-income developing countries do better than emerging markets. So there's a bit of diversity around the region, around the world. I also would point out, I think that it's interesting to note that there's some correlation between performance across the various types of institutions. So for instance, we noticed that, sorry, I have to get my notes. We noticed that that countries that have good project appraisal and project selection capacity also tend to be good at PPP management. So so there is some linkage there. Countries at the same time that monitor public assets really well, that's number 15 at the very top. If you monitor the stock and quality of your public assets very well, they tend to do better at managing PPPs as well. And we kind of think that may have to do with the fact that many advanced economies and a number of emerging markets have moved towards modern public sector accounting regimes, including accrual accounting in the public sector. So there is some linkage between the different components of this assessment framework. So what does it mean? Well, we can see here that if you now on the x-axis you have institutional strength as we assess it across countries, and then on the y-axis what are the efficiencies? I mean, how efficient are countries in delivering public sector investment, and clearly there's a link, right? There's a positive correlation. It's statistically significant to the extent that you could be statistically significant with a sample of about 25 But across this universe, we see that institutional strength does lead to more physical output, so more roads, right? So if you have better institutions, you get your road network gets longer, faster. It's also associated with more better perceptions of public sector investment quality. I mean, the example here that I often give, the difference between the physical indicator measure and the perception indicator relates to an experience I had living in Uganda. I lived in Uganda for some years before I came to India. And there they have road network that traverses the country and goes off to the borders. And so if you just measured the